Everyone is tired. Not as a figure of speech, not as a collective exaggeration, as a permanent state. People wake up tired, work while tired, go to sleep tired, and even when they're not doing anything physically exhausting, the exhaustion remains. This isn't normal, but it has become common. Never before have people slept so much. Never before have there been so many tools for comfort. Never before has it been so easy to avoid heavy physical labor, and yet the dominant feeling is the same: exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from the body, but something harder to explain. A fatigue that doesn't disappear with rest, that doesn't improve with vacations, that doesn't fade after a free weekend. Something that stays. You might recognize the signs: difficulty concentrating, the feeling of always being behind without knowing exactly behind what, a constant mental heaviness, as if the mind never truly shuts off. Even in silence, something keeps running. This kind of fatigue doesn't show up in medical tests. It has no simple name, and because of that, it's often treated as a personal failure: laziness, lack of discipline, lack of purpose, lack of willpower. But when everyone shows the same symptoms, the problem is rarely individual. The human body hasn't changed that much in a few decades. The biology is essentially the same. What changed was the environment, and it changed radically. Today, no one is truly still, even when sitting, even when lying down, even when supposedly resting. The mind remains occupied, jumping from stimulus to stimulus, from thought to thought, from expectation to expectation. There's a crucial difference between resting the body and resting attention, and that difference is almost never noticed. Most people believe they are resting, when in reality they are only switching the type of stimulation. They leave work and enter the screen, leave the screen and enter the feed, leave the feed and enter comparison, leave comparison and enter anxiety. The cycle never breaks. And when the mind doesn't rest, fatigue accumulates silently, without physical pain, without immediate collapse, but through constant wear. It's an exhaustion that's hard to name because it doesn't come from a single effort. It comes from the sum of micro-tensions, small demands, small decisions, small expectations, small fears, all at the same time. That may be why so many people feel constantly on, even when they want to switch off, as if stopping meant losing something, as if real rest were a risk. And that's the strangest part, because in theory, resting has never been easier, but in practice, it has never been harder to allow yourself to rest. Something has changed in the way society functions, something subtle but pervasive, something that turns simply existing into a continuous activity. And that's what makes this exhaustion different from all others. It doesn't come from physical overwork. It comes from excess presence, constant availability, constant attention, as if disappearing for a few hours came with guilt. This isn't just a personal feeling, it's a collective pattern, and collective patterns rarely appear by accident. Maybe what we call fatigue is just the visible symptom of something larger, something happening to everyone at the same time, every day. And maybe the right question isn't, why am I tired? But rather, what exactly is keeping us this way? When people say they are tired today, they are rarely talking about physical effort. It is not the exhaustion of carrying weight, walking long distances, or spending the day doing intense manual work. It is a different kind of fatigue. quieter, constant, and much harder to shut off. The body can stop. The mind often cannot. There is a fundamental difference between physical fatigue and mental fatigue, and that difference is rarely taken seriously. Physical fatigue has a clear limit. The body asks for rest, sleep, recovery, and when that happens, it usually heals. Mental fatigue works differently. It doesn't come from one great effort, but from an endless accumulation of small stimuli. Too much information, too many choices, too many comparisons, too many expectations. The human brain was not designed to handle this continuously. For most of human history, the mind moved between periods of attention and periods of true emptiness, silence, observation, natural rhythm. Today, that space almost no longer exists. Attention is constantly under attack. Even when there is no explicit task, something is always demanding a response. A notification, a message, an update, a headline, an opinion. And even when none of those appear, the brain has already been trained to search for them. This creates a permanent state of mild alertness. Not panic, not extreme anxiety, something subtler, and therefore more dangerous. A state where the mind never fully disarms. You can recognize it in small signs. Difficulty sitting in silence without reaching for the phone. A sense of guilt when not producing something. The constant feeling that something is unfinished even when everything is done. This kind of exhaustion does not disappear with ordinary rest. Sleep helps, but it doesn't solve it. Vacations relieve it, but they don't cure it. Because the problem is not a lack of rest, it is the inability to disconnect. The mind continues to operate at the same pace, just in a different setting. Another important factor is the fragmentation of attention. Today, we rarely do one thing at a time. Even simple tasks are crossed by interruptions. Thought does not deepen, it jumps. And every time attention is interrupted, there is an invisible cost, a small effort to refocus, a small drain that is not noticed in the moment, but it accumulates. At the end of the day, people often cannot say what they are tired of. They only know that they are. And when this state stretches over weeks, months, or years, something begins to change internally. Motivation fades. Enthusiasm erodes. The world starts to feel heavier than what it gives back. Not because life became harder, but because it became louder. Excess stimulation does not create clarity. It creates saturation. And saturation leads to a strange sensation, always feeling behind, even without a clear deadline, always rushing without knowing toward what, always trying to keep up with something that never stops. This produces an exhaustion that has no precise name, but it affects everything: relationships, work, creativity, identity. Because when the mind is constantly occupied, there is no space left to process one's own life. Thoughts stay shallow. Emotions are not integrated. Everything turns into immediate reaction. And living in constant reaction is exhausting. That may be why so many people feel they are merely functioning, not truly living, completing routines, responding to stimuli, enduring the next day. This is not a problem of willpower, not a lack of discipline, not an individual failure. It is the result of an environment that demands constant presence, continuous attention, and immediate response, without offering real mental recovery. And when this kind of exhaustion becomes normal, it stops being questioned. It becomes treated as part of adult life. But it isn't. This exhaustion is not natural. It is learned,
and above all, maintained. Which leads to an unavoidable question. Who benefits from a permanently exhausted society? Because exhausted people question less, reflect less, go less deep. They simply follow. And perhaps this widespread fatigue is not an accident. Perhaps it is a perfectly functional side effect of a system that never shuts down. In the next part, the issue stops being only psychological. It begins to reveal its structure. Because this exhaustion did not appear by chance. It was built quietly.
At some point, fatigue stopped being just a consequence of modern life and became part of its basic operating system. It no longer appears after a difficult day. It shows up upon waking. It lingers throughout the day, and it settles in as a constant background to existence. This does not happen by accident. When we look closely, it becomes clear that contemporary society is organized to keep people in a permanent state of mental occupation, not only working, but thinking, reacting, anticipating, comparing. Free time is no longer empty, it is artificially filled. Silence has become uncomfortable. Pauses have become suspicious. Idleness has been reframed as a moral failure. This is not a side effect of the system. It is one of its mechanisms. The more occupied the mind is, the less space remains for deep reflection, and the less reflection there is, the weaker the ability to question structures, patterns, and choices that feel natural but are not. Fatigue works as an existential shock absorber. It does not need to destroy, it only needs to reduce. Reduce curiosity, reduce emotional energy, reduce the willingness to confront, internally or externally. A tired mind accepts ready-made answers more easily. There is also a constant pressure to turn everything into performance, not only work, but the body, relationships, hobbies, even personality. Everything must produce something. Everything must show results. Even rest has been converted into something that must be optimized. Rest properly, sleep efficiently, relax with purpose. Rest is no longer an end in itself, it has become merely a means to return to productivity. This creates a silent contradiction. Even when people stop, they do not truly rest. The mind continues to operate under the logic of efficiency, evaluating, calculating, comparing. And this is exhausting. Another central factor is constant exposure to the lives of others. Never before has it been so easy to observe trajectories, successes, bodies, routines, and achievements on such a scale. And the human brain was never designed to handle comparison as an industrial process. Continuous comparison erodes identity. It produces a diffuse sense of inadequacy. Even when life is reasonably stable, something feels missing. There is always someone more productive, more balanced, more successful, more fulfilled. This sensation does not generate motivation, it generates depletion. And depletion is not loud, it does not explode, it drains. Over time, people no longer know whether they are tired because they work too much, sleep poorly, compare themselves constantly, or never feel sufficient. Most of the time, it is all of it at once. This prolonged state of exhaustion alters how reality is perceived. The world begins to feel heavier, harsher, more difficult than it actually is. Small problems gain disproportionate weight. Simple decisions feel overwhelmingly complex. Life loses lightness. When everything demands excessive effort, the natural tendency is to avoid depth. Conversations become superficial. Long-term projects feel impossible. Dense thoughts are endlessly postponed. The mind seeks quick relief, something to distract, numb, or interrupt discomfort, and this reinforces the cycle. The more immediate relief is sought, the less tolerance there is for silence, waiting, or emptiness. Fatigue feeds itself. At this point, it stops being merely psychological and becomes structural. It no longer depends on a specific event, it sustains itself. The environment reinforces the behavior reinforces the environment.
What is most unsettling is how normalized this state has become. People begin to believe that living tired is simply the natural cost of adulthood, that exhaustion is a sign of responsibility, that always being at the limit is proof of commitment. But this narrative hides something essential. A genuinely healthy society does not need to keep its members exhausted in order to function. When fatigue becomes the rule, something is wrong with how the system is organized. Because tired people lack the energy to imagine alternatives. They lack the stamina to sustain necessary conflicts. They lack the clarity to perceive that life could be structured differently. They simply continue. And perhaps that is precisely what makes this fatigue so persistent. It does not completely paralyze. It keeps individuals functional, yet incapable of stepping back far enough to see the whole picture. This is not an individual failure. It is a cultivated condition. And as long as fatigue is treated only as a personal problem, something to be fixed with more coffee, more discipline, or better productivity techniques, its true cause will remain untouched. Because this kind of exhaustion does not ask for quick solutions. It demands questioning. And questioning requires energy, exactly what is being drained every single day. In the final part, this becomes even clearer, because fatigue does not affect only the body and the mind. It shapes behavior, choices, and even the way people accept the world they live in. And when this effect is observed carefully, it becomes difficult to ignore an uncomfortable conclusion. Perhaps fatigue is not merely a symptom of modern life. Perhaps it is one of its most effective tools.
At some point, fatigue stopped being a warning sign and became something normal, not just acceptable, but expected. Those who aren't tired seem out of place. Those who say they're fine sound suspicious, as if exhaustion were silent proof that someone is living the right way. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If everyone is tired, what exactly is exhausting us? The answer rarely appears clearly because modern fatigue doesn't have a single face. It doesn't come only from work, lack of sleep, or financial pressure. It comes from the accumulation of constant demands, many of them invisible. Demands that don't present themselves as violence, but as expectation. You're expected to be available, expected to respond, expected to keep up, expected to adapt. And all of this happens without real pauses. The problem isn't effort. Humans have always exerted themselves. The problem is that neutral zones no longer exist, moments where no performance, opinion, reaction, or positioning is required. Even silence now needs justification. In this environment, fatigue stops being a consequence and becomes the atmosphere. It shapes decisions. Tired people choose what's easiest, not what's truest. They avoid necessary conflicts. They tolerate uncomfortable situations out of inertia. They postpone important changes because they don't have the energy right now. And that right now never ends. Over time, fatigue begins to affect something deeper, self-perception. People no longer know whether they're unmotivated because something is wrong or simply too exhausted to feel anything clearly. Life slips into autopilot. Work, consume, rest poorly, repeat. And the longer this repeats, the harder it becomes to imagine another way of living. Not because it's impossible, but because imagining requires energy, and all available energy is already spent on daily survival. This is where fatigue becomes socially useful and politically neutral, not because someone orders it directly, but because systems function more smoothly when people lack the energy to question them consistently. Fatigue doesn't produce rebellion, it produces resignation. It doesn't silence by force, it silences through wear. None of this requires a secret plan or a clear conspiracy. The mechanism is simpler, and precisely because of that,
more effective. Structures that reward excess, speed, and total availability inevitably generate exhaustion. Then they treat that exhaustion as an individual failure. You need better organization. You need to be more productive. You need to rest properly. But rarely does anyone ask, rest from what, and for what purpose? Perhaps the most disturbing realization is that fatigue isn't preventing the system from working. On the contrary, it's perfectly integrated into it. Tired people keep producing, consuming, and following rules. They just do it without enthusiasm, without presence, and without the energy to resist. This isn't collapse, it's stability. And maybe that's why it's so hard to talk about this honestly, because admitting fatigue is structural means acknowledging that it can't be solved only with individual fixes. It requires questioning rhythms, expectations, values, and priorities that have been normalized for decades. Fatigue, in this sense, acts as a silent filter. It doesn't stop you from living, it only prevents you from stopping long enough to ask whether this life makes sense. And that may be the most unsettling point of all. We're not tired because we failed. We're tired because we learned to live inside a model that demands too much and gives too little back. As long as this isn't questioned, fatigue remains, quiet, persistent, normalized, not as an accident of modern life, but as one of its basic conditions. And perhaps the clearest sign that something needs to change isn't extreme burnout, but the fact that we've accepted exhaustion as a permanent state without even remembering what it felt like to live without it.